before we jump into Revelation, we're going to jump into a book that we've referenced a couple of times now, another book that has some apocalyptic literature. We're going to go back into the Old Testament. We're going to go to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. Oh, I didn't bring a marker. I can't write that. I'm so sorry. Daniel chapter 7. So, if you recall, Daniel is one of the Israelites who was taken into captivity into Babylon because he was, handsome and talented, and they wanted to bring him as the best of the best kind of a thing to Babylon. And he gets there with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, although that was their Babylonian names, not their Hebrew names. And Daniel might be one of those books that's a little hard to. I think I had to go to the index of my Bible to remember exactly where Daniel was. I was having trouble. I also had a Bible that was hard to flip. One thing I'll say about this week's preparation for this chunk of Revelation is that the commentary that we're working out of really naturally opens up right to, that time I went to chapter 14. But it was like, the first time I opened the book this week, it went right to chapter 13. And I was like, that's so perfect and easy. It's so much easier when the book opens right to where you want it to go. Daniel chapter 7. Have we found it? We're still flipping. Daniel, who is seen as a wise man, wiser than all the wizards and sorcerers and magicians in all of Babylon, so that he becomes King Nebuchadnezzar's kind of right-hand guy for interpreting things. And so here in chapter 7, we get a vision that Daniel has. So this is Daniel's vision. Circling on it there, Daniel chapter 7. So we're gonna go through this pretty quickly. We won't spend too much time dissecting this section verse by verse, but you'll understand later when we get to our Revelation why this is important. So would someone please begin reading in chapter 7. We're going to read the whole thing, but we might stop partway through. So if someone wouldn't mind beginning in chapter 7, verse 1.
In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. And there were before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule." After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully.
All right, we'll stop there for now. So, what's going on? Does it sound like Revelation?
Yes.
It does. It sounds like we haven't gotten to talk yet about the beasts that we will speak about in a moment, but we've certainly seen scary creatures in the book of Revelation. It's a vision, and there's these things, and it's confusing. But definitely hear a lot of the same language. We're hearing horns that symbolize power. These beasts are definitely not good things. These were scary animals, right? This is not the same thing as a lamb. We have a lion and a bear and a leopard, all angry, dangerous beasts that you did not want to encounter in the wild. And so definitely Daniel is seeing something that is frightening and unsettling. And fortunately, there's actually a little bit more. So I'm sorry, before we go on to the interpretation of it, let's read the next section here. If someone would begin reading at verse 9. We'll read 9 through 14. Still of chapter 7.
As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow, the hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body was destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed.
All right, thank you. So some of that should have hopefully made a little bit more sense. Who do we think the Ancient of Days would be? God, right? So Ancient of Days comes and sits on the throne, and he's, his clothing is white like snow, and so is his hair, and there's blazing fire. Sounds a lot like the depiction we get of the throne room in Revelation. So we have that, and then court is convened, right? And so then we have the voice of the arrogant one speaking. So that could potentially be Satan, the one who talks when he shouldn't talk. And so we get this description of these beasts being killed and losing their power, even though they get a little time on earth. But so we have that going on. And then there's this wonderful section here, and suddenly one like a son of man. So who would that be? Jesus. That's why he refers to himself as Son of Man. This idea of he's a Son of Man, but so it's interesting to think about that phrase when you think Son of Man. Why would Jesus refer to himself? Because that just sounds like a human. A Son of Man is a human person. But this human person comes with the clouds of heaven, and he is able to approach the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him. He's given dominion and glory and a kingdom. So this definitely doesn't sound like a normal human person. This is a very special human person. He's given a kingdom so that those of every people, nation, and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will never pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. So there we have a definite depiction of Jesus' kingdom, people from all over the world coming together. Beautiful to think about that depiction here in Daniel, right? I mean, sure, Revelation, after we have seen Jesus' ministry and death and resurrection, and then he gets to explain things to his disciples, to then have someone say these types of things. But here's Daniel, and he's describing the same glorious vision we get in Revelation, which is pretty amazing to think about how that all connects together. So we have that, and then the next section we get is the interpretation of the vision, which isn't quite as much detail as we get in Revelation. If someone wouldn't mind reading, let's just go for it because I think it's important. We'll start at verse 15, and I think we'll just finish off the chapter, if someone wouldn't mind, verse 15 to the end of chapter 7.
I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the true meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The four great beasts are four kingdoms that will rise from the earth. But the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the true meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws. The beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on his head and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell, the horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me this explanation. The fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his saints and try to change the set times and the laws. The saints will be handed over to him for a time, times and a half a time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be handed over to the saints, the people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself.
All right, so I think that's a good description of what it would be like to see these kinds of visions. How are you going to respond to it? Probably feeling a little nauseous, the blood's going to flow away from your face. It's pretty understandable that even after he gets an explanation. And that's another interesting point of this, right, is that when Daniel wants to know what's going on, how does he find out? He's approached by one of those nearby. How does John oftentimes find out what's going on in Revelation? There's an elder there to explain it to him. So again, we're seeing not only similar literary devices and elements, but probably just a very similar experience. God showing them this apocalyptic vision that's symbolizing things in the future, and then there's someone there to explain it to him. So again, we have this interesting depiction of this Ancient of Days and this fourth beast. So the way this is interpreted is that when he says, when the one saying near says, these huge beasts, 4 in number, are 4 kings who will rise on the earth, or 4 kingdoms, that what Daniel is seeing is 4 different sort of empires that will come. He's looking at the coming history. So people will try and determine which beast is which kingdom, and that's probably not the way to go with this, is to figure that out. But what's interesting is that when you get to the 4th beast, who arrives at the time of the 4th beast? Who shows up? We saw it in the earlier portion there. The Son of Man shows up, right? At the time of the 4th beast. So if these beasts are earthly kingdoms, real historical empires, what would have been the most logical, big, scary, powerful empire at the time of Christ? Rome. So that's kind of where we get there. And so if you're going to figure it out who the rest of them are, you have to work backwards from Rome. And so, there's different thoughts on that, but we're not going to take a lot of time to figure that out at the moment. The important thing is to recognize that Daniel is seeing a progression of history, these different powers who will rise and fall and rise again, but ultimately the Son of Man will come and be granted dominion by the Ancient of Days, and so his kingdom will last forever, even though these other powerful and frightening kingdoms, kingdoms that persecute the saints, right, that hunt down and kill the saints, that they will be put in their place, will be destroyed eventually. So, again, I could have opened this up, I could have put it on a screen or something and said, let's read our next chapter in Revelation off the screen, and you might have thought, oh yeah, that's Revelation, right? Sounds so very similar, doesn't it? It's fascinating. Questions or comments on that before we now jump into Revelation? Or thoughts? All right, then let's keep moving. So we're going to Revelation chapter 13, picking up where we left off last week. So at the end of chapter 12, right, in chapter 12 we have the story of the woman, right, the woman who begins as the Old Testament church, gives birth to the Messiah, and then becomes the New Testament church, us. You caught in Daniel, the times, and half a time? You caught that in there, right? There it is. It's not just John's invention, right? So we have the story of the woman, and how this dragon has come and is trying to get the woman, but he can't. He is stopped. And so now his new tactic is going to be to attack the children of the woman, which is us, right? So the message of chapter 12 is that the church, the body of Christ on earth, will not be overcome, but the beast is going to be trying to pick away as many of the members of the body of Christ as he can. And so we get that really ominous line in verse 18 of chapter 12, the dragon stood on the sand of the sea. You kind of imagine, I can't help it, like he settles down, the dramatic music of the scene has stopped, and all you hear is the crashing of the waves, and the demon is kind of glaring out into the sea, waiting, right? And now we get chapter 13. So if someone wouldn't, let's see, how far should we start? Verse 1 through, let's just start with verses 1 through 4, and we'll start there.
And the dragon stood on the shore of the sea. I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear, and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had healed. The whole world was astonished and followed the beast. Men worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshipped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can make war against him?"
All right. So this is what the dragon has been waiting for on the shore, right? He sees this beast coming up, and based on the description of this beast coming out of the sea, do you think that he would be related in some way to the dragon? And what might give that away, that they could be somehow related to each other? I would say probably the number of heads, right? Good way, if you're going to try to tell if two dragons are related, count the heads, and if they match, there's a good sign that they're connected. So he's not the same as it's not the same as the dragon, right? This beast coming up, it had 7 heads and 10 horns on each of its head, and then on its horns were 10 crowns. So interestingly, the dragon has crowns on its heads, but this beast has crowns on its horns. So what we're maybe seeing here is kind of a dilution of that power. It's being spread out more, which will make more sense. But look at that description in verse 2. I'm sorry, let's go back to verse 1. On its horn were 10 crowns, and on its heads were blasphemous names. So if a word is on your head, that's going to be the word that you speak. Like when we're sealed with the seal of God, right? What do the sheep say? They say, Ba, right? So what is this beast going to say? It's going to speak blasphemy. So he's coming and he's mocking God and mocking God's people. And then in verse 2, the beast I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth like a lion's mouth. Where have we just read about those 3 animals? In Daniel. But there, it's 3 separate beasts, right? So Daniel is seeing a progression of 3 separate empires, and these animals represent each empire. But here, it's one beast that has all of those characteristics. So what we should probably look at this is not as one particular political power like Daniel had, but as it's symbolizing all of them. This is telling us something about this beast, is that he's not one empire, but multiple empires of all sorts, who has that worldly power with the horns and worldly glory with the crowns. So that's what's going on there. And then it says, one of its heads appeared to be fatally wounded, but its fatal wound was healed, and the whole earth was amazed and followed the beast. So this is kind of weird. What's up with this fatally wounded thing? I mean, one thing we can probably say is that it's one of those, the Hydra from Greek mythology. You cut off one of its head and 2 grow back in its place. Here, this beast, if you kill one of its heads, it'll grow back. And so again, giving us the impression that this is not one political leader or one empire, because we have seen empires rise and fall. But what happens? One powerful dictator rises and falls, and who takes his place? Another dictator of some sort. Unfortunately, we see that pattern a lot in the world. A country gets, unfortunately becomes under control of some sort of dictator, and he changes the power structure of the country so that even then, when someone overthrows him, it's really easy for someone to slide back into that vacuum of power and do the same thing over and over again. So we see that happening. If this is the 4th beast, so in Daniel, right, we didn't get a lot of visual information about that 4th beast, right? The first 3 beasts in Daniel are depicted as these animals. The 4th one is just depicted as having iron teeth and dangerous claws, destroying, right? So if this is connected to that 4th beast, it's interesting to think about where did this beast come from? It came out of the sea. Now, where were God's people in relation to Rome. Rome was across the Mediterranean Sea. So it would be easy to associate the invaders from Rome with the sea. I mean, because the people of Israel could have stood on the shores of the Holy Land, the Promised Land, and looked out across the sea, and they couldn't see Rome, but there it was over there. And where was John writing this? He was writing from the island of Patmos, which he could stand on the shore and look across the sea to where Rome was. So it's interesting that we have this beast coming out of the sea, which might at least flavor it to make people think that this is Rome. At the time of Jesus, or excuse me, at the time John's writing this, Rome certainly would have embodied everything that the beast here represents. This would have been a representative of what the beast is like. So we can think about Rome and what you know about Rome as we're looking at this, because it does make a help, but it is not only Rome, right? This has things to do with us, because again, we're looking at patterns throughout history, and Rome is just part of that broader pattern, right? So the one of its heads is fatally wounded, could represent leaders rising and falling. What's interesting, I was reading the commentary, is that the Emperor Caligula, he was near to death, and then seemingly miraculously overcame some illness that he had. And what happens when a political leader survives a near-death experience, or especially think like a leader survives an assassination attempt? If a leader has, someone attempted to assassinate a leader, and then the leader pulls through, or they couldn't kill him, right? What can that do for his political image? It can enhance it, right? I mean, think about positive leaders. Think about Teddy Roosevelt, right? He had that bullet caught in, it was the notes from his speech, I think. It wasn't a Bible. That would be a great story if it was a Bible, but I don't think it was. But he had something in his pocket, and a bullet got stuck in that. I mean, imagine what that would do for your ratings as a political leader if somebody, or Ronald Reagan's thing, right? Ronald Reagan. He was, there was an attempt, and then later he's at that press conference after he's better, and a balloon pops, and he says, "You missed me," and everyone laughed, right? So imagine what a savvy political leader can do with something like that. There was also Nero, who probably already at the time of John is persecuting Christians and Jews together. What's interesting to think about is that early Christian persecution was really connected to Jewish persecution, because Jews and Christians had the same problem in the eyes of the Roman state, which is they're practically atheists. They don't worship the gods that everyone's supposed to worship. They're going to bring down all kinds of problems on us, and the Roman political machine was tied to their pagan religion. So anybody who wasn't on board with that was an enemy of the state, essentially. So this is already happening in the Christian world. And something about Nero is that I think he committed suicide, but anyway, he died, and there was a public funeral for him, but there were rumors that he wasn't really dead, that he had absconded, and he was going to come back and take his throne. And other people who said he did die, but he's going to come back from the dead and take his throne. And so eventually those rumors died out, because he didn't come back. He didn't come back. But so that's a thing that's happening in their political world, is that there are powerful political leaders who have seemingly died and come back, or have died, but there's rumors of them coming back. And so this could be a reference to something along those lines. But ultimately for us, just remember that you can't kill this beast by chopping off a head, because the new head is going to grow up in its place. And so, verse 5, the beast was given a mouth to utter boasts and blasphemies. It was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. 42 months. Remember that math the pastor showed us last week? That connects to time times and half a time to 1,260 days, 3.5 days, right? So this is saying that this beast is going to be around for the duration, right? It was around when Jesus ascended. It's going to be around until he comes back. That's what they're telling us. So it began to speak blasphemies in verse 6. Began to speak blasphemies about God, to blaspheme his name and his dwelling, those who dwell in heaven. And it was permitted to wage war against the saints, to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All those who live on the earth will worship it. Everyone whose name was not written from the foundation of the world in the book of the Lamb, who was slaughtered. So here we have a reference to the book of the Lamb. And remember that earlier we read, what chapter was that with the seal of God on people's heads? What chapter was that? I don't remember. Chapter 4? Something like that? Oh, it's in there. We can flip back and find it. The passage about how the angels are holding back the winds, right? And then another angel comes and says, hold on, you can't destroy the earth until we have sealed everyone whose name is written in the book And so we get that invisible mark on our foreheads, right? The seal of the Lord. So God's saints are sealed. And so here we have, in verse 8, all those who live on earth will worship it, everyone whose name was not written from the foundation of the world in the book of the life of the Lamb who was slaughtered. So it's saying that if you're not a Christian, you worship this, which is kind of interesting. And maybe you've heard that before, the idea of, it's not very helpful. I've heard people say that any religion that isn't Christian is Satanism, right? Because behind every false religion is the devil pulling the strings, okay? That might be true, but I wouldn't open a conversation with something like that, right? Because people don't like to be accused of being Satanists, you know, unless you claim to be a Satanist, in which case they would just say thank you. But so here we have this idea that if you're not one of the sealed of God, this is what you worship, essentially, right? You're worshiping something connected to this. And there's even more to go along with this that will even broaden our definition. But what do we have here? We have a depiction of the human political machine, right? We already talked about that first horseman of the four, the conqueror, the one who comes and looks righteous, right? This beast has 7 heads, which is the number of God's work on earth, and he has earthly glory. So he looks pretty good, but what does he do? He comes just like he comes as every powerful faction or group or influencing person who is simply there to amass power and glory for themselves. And so we can look at any political person. We can easily throw out the reference of Hitler, right? I mean, he's the easiest one. He's the Rome of our day, probably, of our generations, I would suppose. Still, even how long ago he died, he still kind of represents that. And so we have someone who comes and claims to be righteous and gathers things to himself and conquers and destroys. And ultimately, what happens? He dies. He passes away, right? We get that promise. That's going to keep happening, despite the fact that he dies, he passed away. And so still, what happens after the fall of Germany, we have then communist Russia begins to look a lot like this. They already kind of looked like that, right? But this conquering thing and how they really wanted their ideology to spread across the world, because communism works by bringing everybody you can under yourself so that you can continue to feed the machine. So you can see it like that. Again, communism on paper looks pretty righteous. Sounds a lot like, wow, how we should live as Christians, having things in common, right? And yet, when it's this beast, it does not work. It goes horribly wrong. It looks terrible, and eventually it crumbles, falls in on the weight of itself. And so in verse 9, if anyone has ears to hear, let him listen. If anyone is to be taken captive, into captivity he goes. If anyone is to be killed with a sword he will be killed. This calls for endurance and faithfulness from the saints. So we don't really get a positive solution to this problem. Guess what? It's not our problem to fix, because this is something that's going on right now, but when will it end? When Jesus returns. And so we do have that promise. The one kind of glimmer of, I think, positivity that I can find in this is that he's been given, it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. That is a set amount of time. Yes, it is the time of the duration of our time on earth, so if we don't live to see Jesus return, this beast is going to be around for the rest of our lives. But we know that it is promised, it is set, and it is a done deal that this will only last for so long, and then Jesus will come back and it will be over with. So, questions on that section? We covered it pretty quickly, but I think it's interesting now that we get the symbolism of Revelation. It doesn't take as much explanation, right? 7 heads, 10 horns, yeah, sure, old hat, right?
Yeah.
Right. Since most of us have found our seats, I suppose we can carry on in chapter 13. This is kind of nice right now that we went straight from chapter 12 into chapter 13, and so we don't have to worry about what we skipped, right? I was thinking about that. I was like, oh yeah, we need to review what we didn't skip anything. It's just going straight on through, which is so nice. Yay for continuity. And so now we have a little bit of a shorter section here, chapter 13, verses 11 through 18. Would someone be willing to just read that section for us, and then we'll talk through it, verses 11 through 18 of chapter 13. So some people are still eating.
Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. He exercised all the authority of the first beast on his behalf, and made the earth, performed great and miraculous signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of men. Because of the signs, he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast. He deceived the inhabitants of the earth. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. He was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is man's number. His number is 666.
All right, there it is, right? The other thing, the 4 horsemen, and then the mark of the beast, right? Those are the biggies from, well, 2 of the biggies anyway, from Revelation that everybody knows, but no one really understands. Okay, so we had this first beast, and the first beast came out of the sea, right, at the bidding of the dragon. So the first beast serves the dragon, right? And now we have a second beast that comes from the land. Now, let's think about what the difference is between the sea and the land. In Genesis, what did God form out of the dirt?
Man.
He formed man out of the dirt, right? Earlier in Revelation, when the dragon is chasing the woman and he spews that river, and the river's supposed to wash away the woman, who stops the river? Do we remember?
The land.
The earth opens up and swallows it, right? So the earth is seen as part of God's good creation. And yet somehow, from the earth comes this beast, right? So that's one thing. Now let's talk about the sea. In the ancient world, how was the sea viewed? What was it? You stood there, you looked out at the sea, and what would have been on your mind, do you think, looking at the sea? What's that?
Fearful.
Why fearful?
It's uncontrollable.
Uncontrollable, right? The gods of the sea were always the most fickle gods, right? Poseidon, that guy, you didn't know what to do to please that guy. The sea was scary. I mean, think about even in the book of Jonah. Jonah gets thrown overboard into the ocean, and then his little hymn that he sings after that, as he's well, I guess he doesn't sing until he's in the belly of the beast. But when he's in the whale and he's singing about that, he gets this little poem. He's talking about being thrown into the depths and into the pit. The ocean, the sea, was symbolic, if not literally in a lot of people's minds, hell. I mean, and if you can imagine what it might have felt like to, I mean, there's that old thought about the mob making someone swim with the fishes, right? Giving them a pair of cement shoes, sinking, you know. Somebody does that to you, though. I mean, just imagine the horror of that for a moment. To be sinking into the deep, dark parts of the ocean, the pressure, the darkness. I don't know how many people had come close to that and then made it out to then tell everyone about how terrible it was in the ocean, but somebody probably did. Swam down pretty far. I mean, you had people diving for pearls and things like that. People who are dealing with great depth and pressure and holding their breath, and just, I mean, what a terrible place to be for very long. And so the sea was seen as chaotic, right? That's a big thing. The sea is chaotic. Land is a little bit more understandable, except in the wilderness. Wilderness is always a bad place to be. Wilderness and the sea are 2 terrible places to go. But yeah, so we have the land where good things come from, and the sea where these bad things come from. And so out of the sea comes the first beast, but then out of the land comes the second beast. And it says that he has horns like a lamb, right? Lamb is a good thing. It's a good sign, right? The lamb that was slaughtered, that came into the throne room, right? That's a good thing. Lambs were often symbols of good kings. A good king was like a lamb. David, connected to lambs. So you have this power like a lamb, but speaks like the dragon. Right? So he's like what does the sheep of the flock of Jesus say? Bah. What does this lamb say? Roar, or whatever a dragon says. Which the dragon says blasphemy. Right? We know that. The dragon that's been pursuing the woman, that's what that dragon speaks. This other beast speaks blasphemy and has it printed on its foreheads, or on his 7 foreheads. And so this beast is going to speak the same things that the dragon and the other beast speak. In verse 12, it says, it exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and compels the earth and those who live on it to worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed. So this beast works for the first beast, who works for the dragon. So they're all in, both of them are in cahoots with Satan, right? We got a trio here. And it says that it exercises authority for the first beast and compels those on earth to worship the first beast. In verse 13, it says, it also performs great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in front of people. Who can we think of that has called down fire from heaven? Do you remember a story like that in the scriptures?
Good old Elijah.
Elijah, right? I mean, now he prays to God, and God sends down the fire, right? The people who were there would have looked and seen, like, look what Elijah did, even though Elijah would have said, well, God did it, I'm just a servant. So here we have this servant of the first beast and the dragon who is able to call down fire from heaven, right? Verse 14, it deceives those who live on the earth because of the signs that it is permitted to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who live on the earth to make an image of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. It was permitted to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could both speak and cause whoever would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So that's a disturbing thing. Apparently, this second beast, this beast from the land, has the power to make the way it's described in here, to make a statue or a painting, an icon of this beast, make it speak and do scary things, right? What was interesting reading in the commentary is that was a common religious parlor trick in the ancient world. It's really fascinating the lengths that pagan societies went to impress people with their gods, with all kinds of fake things, where there are records of having pagan statues and icons that could talk. Now we also have records saying how they were able to make it appear like they were talking, like religious ventriloquist acts. I remember seeing a really fascinating episode, something on the History Channel, back when the History Channel actually showed history. There was one that talked about, it was something about ancient machines, ancient marvels, and there was an episode that talked all about this particular man, and I don't want to mess up his name, but this particular ancient citizen who was a really good engineer, and one of the things he did was he would design implements for pagan temples. So for instance, if you want to distribute a lot of blessed water, the Jews and the Christians were not the only people who did a type of ritual washing. There were other pagans that did that. And that he actually designed a machine, a coin-operated holy water dispensing machine. So you walk in with your drachma, your denarii, and you put it in. They had models of how this would work. You drop a coin in the top of the slot, and it would. And what you do is you drop a coin in as an offering to the god, and then water would come out, and you could wash your hands. And people thought, that's amazing, right? Inside, there was a little lever that allowed the water to release from a thing, and so it dispensed the perfect amount of water, and that was magic to them. He also, this crazy thing that he did, where he designed an air-powered door opening mechanism, where the air pressure pneumatics, right, that was a technology that they had, and a few people understood. And so he had this thing set up where a priest at a temple could do this elaborate show and start a fire for a sacrifice, right? He'd start the fire. He would do this prayer and praise and sing to whatever god was in the temple behind him, and he would put the offering on the thing, and around that time, suddenly the massive doors behind him would open with no human hands touching it. But what was going on was that there was a metal tank under the altar, and when you lit a fire on it, it would slowly cause it to heat up, and the air inside would expand, and it would travel through a pipe, and it would move some piston that would open the doors. So the ancient world was full of miracles like this, happening all the time. And, I mean, well, it's a pattern, isn't it, Janine? It's a pattern, right? So this is what's happening in the Roman world, right? Where we have a giant political war machine that has conquered many nations and many peoples and maintaining people by force. And how do they back that up? With the authority of the gods. They have priests who tell you, these are the gods of Rome, and we should worship them, and we should pray to them, because things will go well in the Roman Empire if we worship and pray to these gods, right? Including the Caesar. The emperor was also prayed to and worshipped, right? So there we have it, two beasts. We have the political, powerful beast, and we have the beast of religion. We can call it the beast of religion. Now, this beast might connect to things that we wouldn't necessarily call religion. Janine, did you have an example in your head of what something like that today might be?
With the pardon?
You said something about, and today, even today.
Yeah, I mean, people do things and we think they're miracles.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Deception.
yes, deception, that happens all the time. People will deceive and do miraculous things and make claims for themselves to draw people to them. That's how, I mean, think of the power that, I mean, we still have cults, right? I mean, there's a big problem in the world with people who claim to be an alien from outer space, or an ancient life form, or Jesus himself, and they might even back that up with something miraculous, or they'll use tricks and things like psychogenic drugs on their followers, or even a low protein diet. It weakens it malnourishes you to the point where you become more malleable. And so a lot of these cults will not necessarily have the best diet because it makes you as a follower a lot more easy to handle. Yeah.
You go to a magic show,
Mm.
they cut the people in half and then they miraculously come back together.
Well, that's
or
true.
Or they levitate.
Yeah, I would say that's slightly different just because they're not trying, I mean, those magicians they're trying to make money, they're trying to earn a living. Right. We're still amazed by that. Absolutely. I think, when I think about this in today's world, let's open up the floor, I guess, we have a little time. So if the first beast is the political power structure, it could be an emperor, it could be a large business empire, right? The first beast can take many different forms. It doesn't just have to be politics, it could be other things. But can we think of then examples of what in our world today could be like this second beast? Not necessarily a religion as we would call it that, but someone who points us towards the first beast and says, hey, this is really important, and might even do wonders to make that first beast look better? I don't know, I might be leading. I have an idea. I wanted to hear if you guys have ideas.
Our political system.
Okay, so what would be the second beast then for our political system?
Their representatives
Okay.
and go to this person. You gotta support this person because
Yeah.
they provide all this.
I mean, you look at, if you want to get elected, you have to be able to show you do things like public service, right? You get your photo shot so that you're, feeding the homeless person or cleaning up a park or building a home for the homeless or something like that, right? And so it's this drawing of our hearts in, right? So it's not just fear of the political machine and their war. It's also, oh, look at that. They look pretty good. They're going to help me out. It's all playing into that image, right? That's not bad. I like that. I was thinking about specifically those wonders and about the misuse of science or scientism. I guess one thing I should say is that not all political power necessarily has to be seen as the first beast, right? There are times and places where governments do good things, they serve the people, they're not blaspheming Christianity. Even if they're a secular government, they're not necessarily mocking Christianity. So we don't have to look at every government official and think, you're just a cog in the machine that is the dragon. You don't have to think that. But we do see those sorts of things happening with that beast, right? It happens quite regularly in our world that Satan, the dragon, tempts us as humans in this political world to become like the dragon. I mean, think about how easy that is. Anybody who has any little bit of power, right? Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't remember who said that. And so that's the temptation. So maybe it can be helpful to think of it that way, is that the temptation towards people in positions of power is to become like this dragon. That is Satan pulling the strings, right? Yes, ma'am.
When somebody does go to politician or whatever, there's usually this undercurrent that destroys it.
Well, that's just it. That's the
That's why
temptation.
it's hard to get honest.
Yeah. That's the temptation, right? That's the beast or the dragon tempting people who are idealistic and good politicians to accept bribes, to tamper their idealism because they start to think, oh, we'll never get a law passed that will just outlaw all abortions, right? So how many people compromise because of fear and doubt, and then how many people who maybe started out with good intentions become wheelers and dealers and amass all kinds of dirty secrets about themselves because the power goes to their heads. That's the temptation of the beast.
Or the honest person doesn't care to be put through the ringer.
Right, yeah, it keeps you away, exactly. Looking at Hitler as our example, the Nazi, the Third Reich, right? And their beastness of conquering and even the claim that they're trying to make the world a better place, right? In their mind, that's what they're trying to do. They were righteous in their own mind, self-righteous as we would call it. But what were things that Hitler did to back himself up? He did huge building projects. One of the things he had planned before his demise was a huge redo of Berlin, which was going to have massive buildings. It was going to look like Rome, but 10 times more opulent, and huge museums and things. That was in his mind. He had plans for things like giant, trains that were, as wide as a 4-lane highway. I mean, he had all these visions because he saw that as that's what he needed. He was very good at utilizing a religious nature, right? He appealed to ancient German paganism, right? This idea of, we have been here for thousands of years in this land. This is our land, right? He connected to those sorts of things. He created a sort of secret society, cultish religion around himself. And he used the state church of Germany, right? That was a big deal. There were the state church, right? That's probably a reason why we maybe shouldn't have state-run churches, right? And there's more of this that comes out later in the book of Revelation, that this second beast can be people who look like Christians, right? It doesn't have to be the pagan priests of the Roman world. It can be people who look like Christians. Revelation gets more and more into detail with that later, even to the point where we have someone who looks like a woman, looks like the church, but is corrupted. And so that's a thing that happens more later. Here, the second beast could be Christianity, could be something else. And so Hitler kind of used both. He used paganism, he used the church. I read this great quote from Hitler. That's a weird thing to say. This very interesting quote from Hitler about complaining about the Christian religion of Germany. He said something to the effect of, German Christianity is so flabby and useless. If only we had a religion more like the Turks, referencing Islam, right? Because in Islam, you can motivate people to do things for the state. But Hitler's sitting there trying to get these Christians to sell out their neighbors, right? And to toe the line and to shift their focus towards him. He wanted to replace the crosses in the state churches with swastikas. He was trying to change the narrative of German national Christianity to make him a sort of new Messiah. You can think about things that Muhammad did, right? Or Joseph Smith did, where they're drawing attention away from Jesus and onto themselves. That's what Hitler was trying to do with the Christianity in Germany. He could kind of do it with the state church, but there were all of these other independent churches that, some of them may have gone along with it, but others of them said, no, we can't do that. And they actually got together. Lutherans and Catholics signed a document that said, we cannot support this. And imagine getting Lutherans and Catholics to work together on something. Hitler made it happen because they saw him as an antichrist. He's literally anti-Jesus Christ. So, yes, ma'am.
Wasn't the swastika originally a cross, type of cross?
Yes. It has an interesting history.
And then
Yeah,
Hitler
it has an interesting history. It shows up in different places, and actually, it wasn't even. It's existed at different places on the earth at different times, disconnected from each other. And so, yes, Christians did take it and use it as a symbol of a cross early on. Yeah. It wasn't really being used like that so much at the time of Hitler, where he took a Christian, what people would have recognized as a Christian symbol. But yes, it definitely has carried that at different times. But again, to think about what he did there, to think about Hitler's science and his use, his assistance on using rockets, missiles, to shoot at Great Britain. Terrifying weapon, right? If you've never heard of a ballistic missile before in your life, suddenly Hitler has the ability to use powerful chemicals, and they make a terrible noise, and there's a bright fire in the sky, and he can launch it all the way from Germany and hit a target on an island 1,000 miles away. That's horrifying. And so he was doing that to strike fear into his enemies and to show how great he was. Unfortunately, those rockets were not very dependable. I think that and each rocket cost about $1 million. So they launched 100 of these missiles, each one costing $1 million, and they killed maybe 3,000 people, which is horrible. But it was not a particularly effective weapon for its cost. At the end of the war, when he's running out of money and overextended, but he insisted on launching these rockets because of how powerful they appeared. He was using them to try and bolster his own image, pointing to how awesome he was. Yes?
How about the thousands and thousands and thousands of people that he killed, the
Well, there we go. What's he doing? He's attacking those unbelievers, right? Unbelievers in himself. Now, I mean, not to say necessarily that the Jewish people at the time are, I mean, they're not marked with the mark of Christ, right? They don't believe in Christ as their Messiah, so we can't say that. But they still have the Old Testament. They still have the prophecies of Daniel that point towards these horrible beasts that come along. And yeah, I mean, I once heard it said that dictators will always bristle against people who have the Ten Commandments, right? You got the Ten Commandments. What's the first thing on the Ten Commandments? You shall have no other gods. And if you're trying to be a god on earth, that's a problem if you have people who believe that. And so there we have the persecution of people who will simply not just bow down to any old beast who shows up, right? So even today we can see how marvels and wonders, things like, I mean, we can talk about science. Science itself has no moral value one way or the other. It's a tool that we use in our logic. But there is a broad community in the world that has decided that that science can exist, needs to exist apart from the thought of God. And so if you're for God, then you are against science, which is simply not the case, but that's how they'll portray it. And so there we have lots of people who can make all kinds of real-looking wonders, right? I mean, think about the technology. One of the things that there's lots of things to dread about the future, right? We can go on all day about things that might happen in the future and how they could keep us up at night. One thing that I find to be fascinating and a little disturbing going forward is the rise of this idea of virtual reality, that you can exist and have an experience inside of a computerized world, right? I actually saw a story the other day about a virtual reality church and a young woman being baptized in a virtual reality situation. I don't exactly know what to say about that, because she is a believer in Jesus as far as I know, and she desires to be baptized, but in her case, I know she was disabled and unable to leave her house, or difficult to, and in fact she had even said she went to a church and they told her at the door that if you're not able to walk, then you must not have a strong enough faith. And so she stopped going to churches out in the world, but found one in a virtual situation, and actually got baptized in a virtual water. I don't know what to say about that, but we're pushing more and more towards the ability for people to have experienced most of their lives in a virtual setting, and even possibly, as we're exploring artificial intelligence and computers who can function as though they're a human brain, there are people who are working towards the goal of being able to do a scan of our brain and then recreate your personality within a computer, right? Which is unsettling enough. But then imagine you take that and put it in one of these virtual worlds where you're able to create and do whatever you want. You can be a god. And so there are people right now working towards creating a computer heaven, where if you're nearing the end of your life and you're afraid of what's going to happen next, you can have your brain scanned, a copy of you is made and put into the computer that could live forever, as long as the computer's plugged in, and can do all of these things, right? And I think, what a pernicious lie to tell people that you will live on forever. No, you won't. Your body will be dead, and that thing in the computer is a copy of you. It's like a photograph, right? It's a puppet. But that's the kind of wonders that our world is working towards actually being able to create the closest thing to an afterlife that humanity has ever created. It won't be an afterlife. You'll be dead, and there'll be a thing in a computer that thinks it's you, but that's it, right? So that hasn't happened yet. I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't have gone on and on about that. But as I think about what in our world today are the kinds of wonders that the second beast that serves the political power beast are doing, that's the kind of stuff, right? I mean, and I mean, even just think about our phones, right? And our phones and our social media and our internet are all these things that then the political world can kind of take credit for, can say, we're providing, I mean, you know, there's all these philanthropists who are trying to spread internet all over the world, which is great, but as they do that, they're also amassing prestige and fame and money for themselves too. So we have these wonders of science that are extremely powerful, and if they get into the hands of the wrong person to control them, can definitely be seen as wonders pointing us towards this first beast, this political thing. Yes?
That's the same with the computer itself. I mean, how often do you drive past another car and you see all these young people in a car And what are they doing? Are they talking to one another?
No.
They're sitting there looking at their cell phone, and they're texting.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's stopping people to communicate with one another. So
Right.
even though the computer does an awful lot of great things,
Yeah.
it has an awful lot of evil behind it.
Yeah. And so now we're in a political situation where we're talking about something called net neutrality, which I've never fully understood, but it's essentially if the water department had the right to say, you know what, that water park over there uses an awful lot of water, and if they didn't have it, they wouldn't be able to make any money. So I bet we could charge them just a little bit more than we charge everybody else, and they'll pay it, right? But the water company cannot do that. And so the idea with net neutrality is to keep the internet in a place where the internet providers couldn't turn to Netflix and say, hey, you use an awful lot of internet for your streaming service, maybe you should pay a little more for it. So there's this fight to try and keep that from happening with American internet. I don't know where the status is at that point. But so imagine now all of those people, I mean, not just teenagers, right? I mean, people of all ages,
Right.
but as we go on, as teenagers grow up who are super dependent on their phones, it'll still be a thing, they are dependent on the internet for living their lives. And whoever controls the internet will control those people.
And the sad part is they're sitting next to a human being.
Right, right.
And they're texting other people.
Right,
And they're
What?
texting the person they're sitting next to.
right.
Well, they may be
Also
doing that
true.
as well, I don't know.
Yeah, right. But they're not engaging in verbal conversation. Yeah, they're sending a little private text so that maybe the person driving the car, the parent, can't hear what they're saying. That would
Or
be the
they
point.
just don't know how to talk to each other.
That
They
could be
just
too.
text each other.
That could be too. That could be too.
It's the same problem we had with walking.
Hmm.
People don't walk because we have automobiles.
Right.
I mean, and
Yeah.
that,
Well, and look at the automobile is such a wonder, right?
Oh,
It's more dependable than a horse. And,
Right.
and it can take you anywhere. It's the American dream. It's democracy. I can go wherever I want, whenever I want to. I don't have to rely on buses or trains. But now we're dependent on petroleum, right? And so the political machine that controls petroleum controls the wonder of the car, the automobile, right? There we have it. Another wonder pointing us towards who we should vote for because they're going to keep gas prices down, right? We're about out of time. There we have our two beasts. Well, we got one more thing we have to touch on, right? Yeah, this calls for wisdom. Let one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, because it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. So, according to I was curious to see if there was going to be a little formula or something in the book, but it wasn't that difficult. According to Brighton, if we look at what we've just read, we have three beasts. We have the dragon, we have the beast from the sea, and the beast from the land, right? Three beasts who claim to be righteous, who have the appearance of righteousness with 7 heads or horns like a lamb, right? And so we have 3 sixes. What is the number for 3? Typically in the scriptures, the number 3 means God, right? The Trinity. Now if we had the number 777, what might that symbolize? That would symbolize the Holy Trinity, right? Because 7 is God's work on earth, typically speaking. So 3 sevens, okay, that's a good number, I like it. But 3 sixes, on the other hand, they fall short of the perfection of God. Even that the number of a man, right? What day was humanity created? It was created on the 6th day. Not that they sinned on that day necessarily, but there's that. Also, number 7, the 7th day, God rested and set the 7th day apart as holy to himself. So there we have another reason why the number 7 is holy, and the number 6 falls short of that. What day of the week was Jesus crucified on?
right.
The 6th day of the week, right? So there we have that. So the number 6 typically is a sign of sinfulness. And so here we have a symbol for the unholy Trinity, right? We have this Satan, who is the one sending forth the first beast, and then sending forth the second beast, who there to support the first beast, right? God the Father sends his Son to the earth. God the Father and God the Son send the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit points us back to the Son. We have the behavior of a Trinity here, except that it is an unholy Trinity who is out to get us, as the people who are marked and written in the book of life, right? So, anything else on the number 666 that you think we should say? Yes, ma'am.
Isn't the United States, I've heard that they're going that way, where we have to have our IDs,
Mm.
they want to chip
Oh.
us.
Well, We are. I mean, pretty soon. Right now I've got a chip in my card, right, that I can slide in, and so that sort of it does happen. But what's interesting to think about here is that remember the mark that we receive, we're sealed on our foreheads with the mark of God, right? So this number is probably more like that, where it is going to be something more invisible. We shouldn't necessarily look to a specific thing. It could be a pattern, right? But what I found interesting was the thought of how difficult it is when this beast and when the two beasts work together and they really come out against the faithful, against Christianity, against the church. Persecution, right? What can you not do then anymore as a Christian? You cannot function in public life. If you can keep it secret, right? But it becomes difficult to. Imagine the place in the world where if the government finds out you're a Christian, you get imprisoned. What can you not do in prison? You can't go to the store. You can't do commerce. So this idea that this mark is actually the idea of if you're marked with the mark of God, it can become difficult to function in these societies that are run by the beasts because they are your enemy. It takes that freedom away. Christians are persecuted and pushed underground where they're no longer able to function as a normal citizen of that society. And I thought that was particularly interesting, but we could also look at that mark and that idea as, again, the controlling nature of that beast and what they will do to allow you to make it look like you're being blessed by them, but they can take that blessing away at any time. With the technology we have today, it becomes easier to track. Before we had credit cards, you used cash or you checks, right? But if you don't have cash on hand and you're using your card for everything, it's easy enough to find where you've been purchasing things. There's even now, you don't even have to be marked with something special, thanks to fingerprints and thanks to facial recognition software. That's a big thing in the UK, in London. There's security cameras everywhere, and they can use facial recognition software in a computer to scan thousands of faces and find you in a crowd. And so if they want to find you, they can do that, right? So the mark of that mark of the first beast being able to track you down and control you goes beyond even a chip in your card or a tattoo on your forehead. That mark idea, slaves in the Roman Empire were oftentimes branded or tattooed, and religious cults in the pagan world would use tattoos to literally mark yourself. Even Christians today, it's become more and more common, will mark themselves with a Jesus fish or a Greek or Hebrew word or something like that. And so anywhere in history where tattoos have existed, they have been a way of marking a person as belonging to something else. And so that is the idea we get here. God's mark is a seal on our foreheads, but this is more of like a tattoo kind of an image. And so it's not best to necessarily look for a specific thing that could be the mark of the beast. Just to remember that if you're not marked as one of God's, then you're marked as one of the beasts. And when you're marked as one of God's, life's going to be tough for you. It's going to be hard to function in a society that is controlled by the dragon and the two beasts. So, sorry, almost forgot that part. Anything else?
If life is easy, we better reconsider.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, right? When Jesus amasses a huge following for himself, and then he says, "Eat my body and drink my blood," and a bunch of people walk away, right? So there is something to understand about this world that as sinful creatures, we're not always going to understand or jive with God. And so, if we're taking the easy path, maybe we should evaluate, right? Yeah, you're right. There's something to be concerned about. Or if life is easy, we should be really grateful because we happen to live in a time and place where we get to have that, because that comes and goes very quickly. And while we get to live in an easy place, there are other people in the world who are not, right? So it's one thing certainly to consider. The Christians in Germany who were getting along with Hitler, hopefully they some of them took a chance and analyzed that. We know that happened. People who started with Hitler started to realize that he was in the wrong. So that does happen, right? Things are going well. Stop and think. But it could be a blessing, and you should accept it. In the end, we fall on the promises of Christ. So, anything else? We're out of time. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for putting us in a time and place in history that it is relatively easy to function as a Christian in this society, Lord. We thank you for that blessing. We pray for those who live in parts of the world where that is not the case, where those who are marked with your mark, Lord, have a difficult time, are persecuted, and are struggling. We pray that you would strengthen your saints, Lord, strengthen all of us to persevere through all the trials and temptations that we have in this world, Lord, both now and in the future. In the name of your Son, Jesus, we pray.